All right, folks. Welcome back. Welcome back to the first of the last three meetings we're going to have together before we have the final. I hope everything's well with all of you. I hope you are prepared for the impending deluge of work that is going to rain down upon you. But that's the nature of what you signed up for. So you have to just embrace this time. You have to just dive head into it and just kind of let it be your life for the next, month. And then it'll be over, and then you guys can move on with your lives and enjoy the fact that you put in a lot of work, and that will likely get you some kind of success. Like you'll get some good grades. It'll give you some good vibes that you'll be able to enjoy throughout the summer, and then it'll give you a good sense of confidence about what's to come, whether it be the next semester or maybe you're graduating and maybe this is the last hurdle before you get to move on into the world and take it on and take a little piece of it for yourselves. So as far as this class goes, we're going to finish covering chapter 10 today. And then next week we'll cover chapter 11. The week after we'll cover chapter 12, and that'll be it. We'll finish chapter 10. I'll open up the mini paper for that. That'll be due next week. And then that'll be it for the mini papers beyond the open chapter submission option, which is available until Sunday. Because you only have 1 weekend after that to turn in the paper, which is due 2 weeks from today. And I don't want people writing mini papers the weekend of the time to write the paper. Like you have to be writing the paper and getting it ready to be turned in by the time it's due. As far as submitting the paper, you need to, like I've mentioned before, submit it both digitally and in hard copy form to me on the due date by the end of the class that we meet that day. So I'll open up a digital option for you online. You can turn the hard copy into me that day or prior to that in my office hours anytime, or slide it under my office door. But you have to make sure that you write on it that you are in my 308 class that meets on Tuesday nights, or else it'll be difficult for me to figure out which class the paper is for, because I have papers coming from 3 different classes. So just make sure you do that. You have 2 weeks to get that done. As far as the final paper goes, it's pretty simple. If you've written the 3 mini papers already, which you should have already, because I've given you a lot of opportunities and I've extended deadlines, all sorts of things. So those should be done already. All you have to do at this point is write an introduction. You are the firm manager. This is what's going on with my firm. These are the 3 suggestions I've made to help my firm maneuver through this difficult time or whatever it is that they're experiencing. And that's your introduction. That should be about a page. Then you just throw your 3 papers together, each one with like a subtitle, just kind of denote the fact that it's a separate kind of section of the paper. Do something with the verbiage at the beginning and the end of each one just to create a flow through the paper. And then you write a conclusion, which is just basically restating the introduction, roughly a page, summarizing up all your points, and putting the whole thing together shouldn't take you more than a couple hours. So if you've already done your mini papers, which you should have already done, then I would suggest jumping on this now, like getting it done, getting the final paper done, and then turning it in, and then not having to worry about that anymore. You can have a lot more things to worry about in the next few weeks beyond just the assignments for this class. So make sure that you put the right amount of time into this so that you get the full amount of points on this paper, so that, again, like this isn't the reason why you don't do that great in the class. Like you want this to boost your grade versus it be a further hindrance or any kind of hindrance to doing well in the class. But as I mentioned before, like regardless of how you do on the paper, if you're not passing the exams, you're not passing the class. End the story. Like this is not an English course. I do not base your grade on the paper. Your grade is based on how well you are learning the material and how well you're exhibiting that, and that is all reflected in your exams. So that is the dominant factor in determining your grade, and that is the end of the story on that. Now, as far as the final grade goes, I mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. The final itself is not curved, but the final grade is curved. So I take your score out of 100 on the final, and then I add that to your overall points in the class, and then I curve the entire class based on your points. I create brackets like I do for the exams, and then wherever you wind up is the grade that you get relative to everybody else. So don't depend on a curve, but the final exam can have a big impact on your grade. It can have a big positive impact on your grade because nobody else is going to be curved, and therefore if you wind up in like the 90th percentile, like just in terms of the points that you get, then that'll have a big impact on your grade relative to everybody else, and it can move you up the ladder. So doing well in the final is really important for those people that are looking for a strong finish for one reason or another. So make sure that you guys don't drop the ball on everything, the paper and the final. Just make sure that you guys have a really strong showing these last few weeks, and it'll work out for you. It'll give you what you want out of this class, the remainder of the class that we have. Are there any questions that you'd like me to address before I continue? Yeah.
So if you procrastinate on the papers, even though you're doing only the 2 submissions, can I still submit the whole paper?
Of course, yeah, no, you can submit the whole paper, and it will need to have a third paper written into it. It's just you won't get that 2% credit for that mini paper. That's the only thing you would miss from it. Yeah. So you can write anything for that third section if you haven't written any mini papers, and it's not going to hurt you that much. So it's not anything to worry about. Yeah. Yeah, just one chapter that we've covered in the class any time throughout the semester. Other questions? All right. So we are at the end. It's a good thing and a bad thing. Obviously, in terms of work, it's a lot to do. I've got to grade all those papers, and then I have to grade finals, which is not ever fun. And then I have to get all your grades figured out. That's not fun either. But in the end, we're all going to be free in a few weeks, which is nice. I'm looking forward to it. All right, so as far as what's going on in the material, we've been covering Chapter 10. Chapter 10 is fairly long, and that's why it requires multiple class sessions to cover it. But finally today we will be able to finish it off. So again, it is an approach that, again, is called game theory. It's meant to help us analyze situations where there is interdependence in decision making, where decisions that are made are not just based on one's own conditions, but also on the conditions of the rivals involved in the context where the decisions are being made. Because of that, in order to optimally behave in those situations, you have to take into consideration what rivals are doing. That is the defining characteristic of this market setting that we've been talking about, oligopoly, in which you have a few firms with large market shares that dominate the market. They share the market, therefore they share the downward sloping demand curve, and they are faced with a dilemma wherein they could be working together and benefiting from the market the same way a monopolist does, get the monopoly profits, split them, and everybody walks away happy on the firm side. But obviously consumers get hurt because monopolists cause inefficiency in markets. They raise prices. They lower the amount of transactions that can occur because the prices are high. People aren't able to buy. The people that would normally be able to buy at lower prices. And so overall, society is hurt by that because there is deadweight loss in consumer surplus. But of course, profits of monopolists are at the greatest they possibly can be in these markets, which is good for the firm. So the firms in an oligopoly can work together and do that, but it's illegal to do that in the United States. So they can't explicitly go about making these agreements. And so all they can really do is sort of try to make an agreement and break the law, which obviously is risky. But if they do that, then there's an incentive to cheat on those agreements, which we've talked about before, and I'll highlight again today, which means that ultimately they would wind up cheating on each other, and they could not get to the higher profits that they aim for. if they only met once in the market. But as we'll see today, we're going to look at first infinitely repeated games. When the firms engage in these types of interactions repeatedly over time, then they face consequences for their actions. And so even though they may not explicitly make an agreement, they could implicitly start to behave as though they have an agreement and behave that way until somebody starts behaving differently, at which point everybody starts behaving that way as well, meaning that they agree to charge a higher price by just charging a higher price. And if somebody starts to charge a lower price trying to undercut everybody, then everybody starts to undercut everybody, and then that winds up in a price war that leads everybody to the Bertrand competition outcome, in which price is then going to be set at marginal cost. There will be zero economic profits. So that's basically what we'll be highlighting today with game theory, the fact that with infinite rounds of these interactions, that there is a benefit to these firms to behave in ways that would benefit them collectively and not engage in cheating type of agreements, depending on the conditions of the market. So again, I'll highlight again what game theory is before I go into these specific examples, but game theory is meant to sort of help us to understand how, individuals in different situations that involve interdependence in decision making can best make decisions. And so that's the approach we've been taking in the chapter. The first part of the chapter dealt with the simultaneous move one-shot games, in which the players make their move at the same time and they only interact once. And so that's where we first identified the fact that there is an incentive for the firms to cheat on each other. And therefore they are in this prisoner's dilemma that I talked about last time, which was also talked about in your introductory course. Anyway, I'm just repeating stuff I've gone through already. I know if some of you have not caught up with the stuff I've covered so far, this probably all seems very foreign to you, but in the end, like, you need to learn it either at one point or another. So make sure that you go back and understand everything I've talked about up until this point and moving forward, because it's not going to get less complicated, which is why I don't make the final cumulative, because, this last part of the course is, complicated, relative to the rest of the stuff we've covered, more complex. So I don't want to burden you with having to learn everything again, but this will require a good amount of time for you to really get it down if you want to do well this last part of the course. Anyway, so I'll just briefly kind of go over the game theory stuff that we've covered so far in the chapter. Then we'll cover infinitely repeated games. Then we'll cover finitely repeated games, in which the firms play these games several rounds, meaning that they're competing maybe over months, years, but they know that eventually this competition will end. Like, maybe the product becomes obsolete. They don't exactly know when it's going to happen, or maybe they do. And that is what will change the outcome of the game, whether they know when the game will end or not. And then finally, I didn't put it on the agenda, but we'll look at the last section after the break, which deals with sequential move games, in which the firms don't make their moves at the same time. One firm makes a move first, other firms react to that, and so we have a approach within the category of game theory that we use to study those type of games, and the outcomes are interesting, and we'll look at how they work and what kind of insights we can gain from that approach as well. So ultimately, all of this and the last chapter are just different approaches to try to sort of understand the best possible this very complex business environment, the oligopoly business environment, which is the most common one, which is the one that most firms will find themselves in the industries that we tend to be consumers in, that we are aware of. Airline industries, video game manufacturers, the film industry is an oligopoly, cell phone manufacturers, cell phone providers are all oligopolies. Most industries are oligopolies. The cereal industry is an oligopoly. There's 4 major cereal manufacturers, and they have 85% of the market share together. So that you'll see that kind of pattern in most industries. So this type of analysis is very relevant, but again, it has to be complicated because that context is complicated. It's just not easy to sort of say, oh, well, yeah, you should just do this one thing, because you can't just do this one thing, because you have to consider what everybody else is doing, because you share the market, and that makes it uncertain. All right, so let's go over what we did so far in this chapter. So we first introduced what this approach is. And again, it is a general framework to aid in decision making when your payoff depends on the actions taken by other players. There's interdependence in decision making. You can't just say, well, I'm going to set my marginal revenue equal to my marginal cost, and that's how much I'm going to supply, and then I look at the demand curve, and that's my price, and these are my profits, and I'm good. That's what a monopolist is able to do because they define the market. The market is theirs. Also, with perfectly competitive firms, in perfect competition, like they set price equal to marginal cost. They just look at their own cost conditions and they figure out how much they can sell in these markets, and in the long run, they'll make zero economic profits. That's just the nature of those markets, but they don't have to consider what everybody else is doing. They are price takers. But again, the situation becomes more complicated in the oligopoly setting. So in the analysis of games, the order in which the players make their decisions is important. We either have simultaneous move games in which each player makes a decision without the knowledge of the other player's decisions, or we have a sequential move game in which one player makes a move after observing the other player's move. So that will be the last approach that we'll look at today via what's called the extensive form of a game, which is like a game tree. Also, we need to distinguish whether or not the game is played one time or repeated times. In a one-shot game, the underlying game is played only once. In a repeated game, the underlying game is played more than once. So a one-shot game might be a situation where you might have, like, let's say, video game manufacturers usually at the end of the year during Christmas season, they will release their new consoles at the same time, right? And they don't know how much their rivals are going to charge. So basically, they can do this type of analysis, a one-shot game analysis, and sort of try to figure out what is the best thing to do, either charge a low price or a high price. And then a repeated game would be, you know, those console manufacturers then settling on prices and then continuously competing over the course of like the next year or two. All right, so what we covered so far is the case of simultaneous move, where the players make their decisions at the same time and they only play the game once. So we can represent that situation via the normal form of the game, which is this table, which is different than the extensive form of the game, which is for sequential move games, which is a game tree, which we'll see at the end of the lecture today. So with the normal form of the game, you've got, in this case, we've got two different players we're considering. The strategies, the decisions that the players can make at any given time are going to be represented by the rows for player 1, which is player A in this case, and by the columns for the second player, which in this case is player B. The payoffs in these cells represent the outcomes of the games, depending on the strategies that the players play and where they overlap. So if player B decides to play left while player A decides to play down, then we look at the payoffs. The payoff on the left in these cells represent the payoff for player A. So the -10 is player A's payoff when player A plays down and player B plays left. And 7 represents player B's payoff when they both play those strategies. All right. So one thing we can do when analyzing these type of situations where, again, there's interdependence in decision making, which means there's a lot of uncertainty with respect to the outcome of these situations, is to try to identify first a dominant strategy. If a player has a dominant strategy, then they will play that strategy no matter what. And so should be the case. In order to identify a dominant strategy, you need to take the perspective of a player. So let's take the perspective of player A and consider what they should do optimally in response to each of player B's options. So considering what player A would do in response to player B playing left, player A can either play up and get 10 or play down and get negative 10. Obviously, up would yield a higher profit. Therefore, player A should play up if player B plays left. If player B chooses right, then player A again can either choose up or down. Up will yield 15. Down will yield 10. 15 is better than 10. So if player B plays right, player A should play up. So regardless of what player B does, we've identified that player A should play up, and therefore player A has a dominant strategy to play up. And that's how you identify it. And you can do the same thing with player B. Consider what they should do in response to player A, each of their options, see which ones that they choose. If they choose the same option, regardless of what their opponent does, and they have a dominant strategy as well. All right. Now, if players don't have a dominant strategy, then they're kind of in an uncertain position. One thing a player might do if they are very uncertain about the outcome and they are very risk averse, meaning they don't like to take any type of chances, is to maximize the worst possible outcome. Look at the worst possible outcomes they might, the situation might result in, and pick the option, the strategy that will yield the best of the worst options. And that's called a secure strategy. It's also called the maximum strategy. It's a strategy that guarantees the highest payoff given the worst possible scenario. All right, so we did this problem to identify the secure strategy for player B. To identify a secure strategy, you take the perspective of a player. Let's take the perspective of player B, consider what they would do. What would be the worst outcome if player A chose up? Well, if player A chose up, if player B chose left, they'd get 20. If they chose right, they'd get 8. So 8 obviously is the worst outcome there for them. And if player A chose down, then again, player B can choose left, get 7, right, get 10. 7 is worse than 10. So 7 is the worst outcome if player A gets plays down. So the worst case scenario is for them to get 7. So therefore, they would want to choose to play right, which is the next best worst option, right? It's like the second best worst option. So that's essentially how you identify a secure strategy. This player does not want to wind up losing and getting the worst possible outcome, so they'll get the next best worst possible outcome. And we were able to identify that via the approach I just took. So that's how you identify a secure strategy. But a secure strategy is not a smart strategy. It's just for a player that's very sort of afraid of taking any kind of risk. They are not taking into consideration what the payoffs are and what the other player might do. So what a player should actually do is try to identify what's called a Nash equilibrium. A Nash equilibrium is a set of strategies in which neither player has any incentive to deviate from. Essentially what you do to identify a Nash equilibrium is you take the perspective of each player, identify their optimal choice in response to each of their opponent's strategies, do the same thing for the opponent, and then wherever those choices overlap will be Nash equilibria for the game. There may not be any Nash equilibria. There may be only one, or there may be multiple Nash equilibria. So again, like I mentioned last time, Nash is the Nash equilibrium. The Nash part of it is named after John Nash, who was this MIT guy. He kind of developed this very important result that seems kind of trivial, but isn't, because it allows us to make predictions about situations where there is this kind of high degree of uncertainty, whereas normally in our profession, in economics, we were not able to make any kind of predictions because, again, we were uncertain about what the outcome could be. But using this approach, identifying Nash equilibrium, allowed us to at least say, well, what are the likely outcomes, which, highly reduces the uncertainty. Even though there might be more than one Nash equilibrium, which is what we identified in some of the examples at the end of the last class, that certain situations will result in multiple Nash equilibria, and therefore we don't know the actual outcome of the game. We can at least narrow it down to those Nash equilibria. It's going to be one of those. We don't know which one, but that's what our analysis can provide, and that's powerful in an uncertain world where the stakes are high. All right, so let's again go through this problem. Again, this is all stuff I've covered already. I'm just going through it because obviously we haven't met in 2 weeks, and I want to make sure everybody's up to speed before I move forward with the rest of the chapter. So to identify Nash equilibrium here, again, you take the perspective of each player and identify what they should do optimally in response to each of their opponent's strategies. So player B, in response to player A playing up, then they can either play left or right. Obviously, left is better than right because left gets player B 20 versus 8, so they would choose left in that case. And in response to player A playing down, player B would choose right because 10 is better than 7. Does player B have a dominant strategy? No, player B does not have a dominant strategy. They're going to play a different strategy depending on what their opponent does. They would have a dominant strategy if they played the same strategy regardless of what their opponent did. All right, now taking the perspective of player A in response to player B playing left, player A obviously will play up because 10 is better than negative 10. And in response to player B playing right, player A will play up because 15 is better than 8. Does player A have a dominant strategy? Yes, player A does have a dominant strategy, and that is to play up. What is the Nash equilibrium of this game? So the way you would describe it is, say, player A up, player B left. But yes, you are correct. That is the Nash equilibrium for this game. So that is going to be the outcome for this game. So just given the analysis, given the fact that we were able to identify the Nash equilibrium, it allowed us to basically just exclude all other possibilities and be able to make a prediction about something that otherwise we would not be able to do without the Nash equilibrium. All right, so that's how you use game theory to sort of figure out, that's how game theory works with the normal form of a game, which is what we've been looking at. Now, in terms of its applications, this is the most relevant one to oligopolies. So we looked at this situation where the firms are in a Bertrand pricing game where they are competing. In this case, we're considering the simplest one, which is the duopoly, 2 firms, and they are competing on prices. They are setting prices, right? So this is a one-shot of the game. They are, again, interacting once, and they have the option to either charge a low price or a high price. So we can say that these are just 2 game console manufacturers. They're deciding what to charge. During the Christmas season, they don't know what their opponent's going to charge, but they do know the payoffs. So if they both were to charge the high price, then they both wind up together working like a monopolist and earning the kind of profits a monopolist can earn, dividing that up. And so they would need to, again, meet behind closed doors to make an agreement to do that. It's illegal to do so. So if they do wind up doing that, they would have to do it illegally, and therefore they couldn't enforce the agreement. Because they can't enforce the agreement, it's clear that each one has an incentive to cheat on the agreement. So let's say they agreed, let's both charge a high price. And then firm B says, haha, I'm going to charge the low price instead. Charge the low price. All the customers buy from firm B instead of firm A. Firm B winds up with 50, whatever million. And firm A winds up losing quite a bit as a result. Firm A has the same incentive. They could charge the low price while firm B abides by the agreement, and they'll get the 50, and the opponent will wind up being screwed, getting the negative 10. So since both of them have the incentive to cheat, both of them will take the incentive to cheat, and therefore both will charge the low price, and therefore the result of the game will be for them to charge a low price and earn 0 economic profit. They wind up just lowering the price to marginal cost and making 0 economic profits. So that is the Nash equilibrium for the game, which again we can identify by taking the perspective of each player and figuring out what they would do optimally in response to each of their opponent's strategies. So in response to player B charging a low price, what should firm A do? Low price. 0 is better than negative 10. In response to firm B charging a high price, what should firm A do? Low price. 50 is better than 10. So A has what kind of strategy? Dominant strategy to charge a low price. taking the perspective of firm B in response to firm A charging a low price, what should firm B do? Low price. 0 is better than negative 10. In response to firm A charging a high price, what would firm B do? Low price. 50 is better than 10. So again, we've identified that firm B has a dominant strategy, and we've also identified that the optimal choices overlap here, low price, which is, again, the Nash equilibrium for the game. So the firms in this type of pricing game will wind up in this Nash equilibrium, which reflects the fact that oligopolists are in what's called a puzzle, because they wind up in a situation that's worse than if they could figure out how to work together and earn the better profits. And so that is going to be the outcome for these type of games, and that's what game theory has allowed us to identify. Obviously, it's a very simple application. The applications get a lot more complicated, and this is a very powerful tool, but this class is all about introducing you to these things. All right, so let's move forward. All right, so the rest of the first section that we covered had to do with other kind of applications that helped us to identify situations where there were multiple Nash equilibria and what that meant for the situation. So make sure you understand all that stuff. All right, now we're going to move on to infinitely repeated games. So based on prior analysis of the one-shot pricing and also advertising games, because we looked at advertising games as well, which I'll go over again. We have another example coming up. So one might be led to believe that collusion is impossible in industry. Collusion is when the firms work together, and the collusive outcome would be the one where they end up making the monopoly profits and splitting it. So the conclusion that it's impossible for that to happen is not correct, since firms in some industries do not play a one-shot game, but instead compete repeatedly week after week, year after year. The appropriate mode of analysis is to consider a situation where the game is repeated over time. So we'll look at the case here of an infinitely repeated game, and that is a game that is played over and over again forever. Players receive payoffs during each repetition of the game, so everybody makes their move, there's a payoff, and then the next round starts, be it the next day or however long each period lasts. Due to the time value of money, though, the fact that $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow, because $1 today can be invested and you can get a return on that. And if you don't do that, there's an opportunity cost to that dollar, which means that $1 in the future will be worth less than $1 today. So $1 earned during the first repetition of the game is worth more than $1 earned in later repetitions. So players must appropriately discount future payoffs when they make current decisions. So if they're deciding what to do today, cheat on an agreement or not cheat on an agreement, and therefore benefit from working together and getting those monopoly profits into the future, the question is, like, is the value of cheating today better than the present discounted value of the profits into the future? Well, it's going to depend on the interest rate. All right, so let's do a quick review of the present value. So the value of a firm is the present value of all future profits earned by the firm. I is the interest rate. Pi represents profits in year I, where I equals 0 to t years. The value of the firm will be, the value of a firm that will be in business for t years is, so that's how many years for now, we'll just leave it open-ended, t is going to equal the profits they could earn today plus the profits they could earn tomorrow, discounted to the present by 1 over 1 plus the interest rate raised to the first power, right? That's the discount factor to get the present value of profits tomorrow. Profits 2 days from now, or 2 periods from now, we're looking at years, so 2 years from now, discounted to the present. So 1 plus I squared, 1 over 1 plus I squared is the discount factor that discounts these profits to the present. Again, the third year all the way to the teeth year. So this is the present value of the firm, the profits into the future. So that's essentially how, like I've mentioned before, how all firms are valued. If you look at stock prices, they are essentially the present discounted value of the dividends that stocks pay out into the future. Dividends being the profits that the firms make that are paid out to the shareholders. For those of you that don't know, I'm sure most of you do. We can represent the present value of these profits into the future via just sigma notation. It's just an easy way to write this whole expression. where this represents the sum of this term from the period equals 0. So 0 is the first period all the way to the teeth, capital teeth period. So however many periods there are represented by this notation here, and then this is the term that's being added. So in the 0 period, in today, you have the same expression, but you have 1 plus I raised to the 0 power. Anything raised to the 0 power is equal to 1, and so therefore that's why you just have pi subscript 0. If the profits earned by the firm are the same in each period, so these profits don't change each period, so it's maybe like some dividend that's paid out that is just agreed upon prior to buying a stock, let's say, and it's constant. And let's say the time horizon is infinite, meaning that there's an infinite amount of these periods, then what you have here is what's called the sum of a geometric series. And the sum of a geometric series converges to a very specific amount, which can be represented by this amount, pi times 1 plus I over I. So if you have these terms being summed into the infinite future, then via some mathematical properties that you learn about in Calculus 2, if you guys wind up taking that, then we can establish that this sum will wind up equaling this amount, pi times 1 plus the interest rate over the interest rate. So this formula is useful in analyzing decisions in infinitely repeated games, and I will show you why in a second. So this is the sort of thing that if I had a problem that required you to use this, I would give it to you because there's no way for you to derive it. As opposed to like the stuff we covered in the last chapter, reaction functions, etc. All that stuff you can get from the information given in the problem, as long as you understand the steps to derive it, which is all reflective of the logic that the theory implies. So you have to make sure you understand that stuff. All right, so now we're going to look at how that plays into the situation that we're looking at, where again these firms are playing these pricing games indefinitely into the future. So consider the simultaneous move Bertrand pricing game presented here. Again, each firm can either charge a low price or a high price. The payoffs are what we've been talking about. As we know, the Nash equilibrium in this one-shot play is for each firm to charge a low price and for them to make zero economic profit. Now, suppose the firms play the game in the table day after day, week after week for all eternity. It becomes possible for them to collude without fear of being cheated on if that is the case. And I'll demonstrate why. So they do this by using what's called a trigger strategy. It's also called tit for tat for those of you that might have learned it with that name in your introductory courses. So a trigger strategy is a strategy that is contingent on the past plays of players in a game, meaning that players will play a certain strategy that they think everybody else is going to play. If somebody deviates from what everybody else thinks they're going to do, then let's say by cheating, let's say everybody assumes, we're all going to abide by this agreement, we're all going to charge a high price, we're going to make monopoly profits, and then somebody decides, I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to charge a low price. As soon as somebody does that, that triggers everybody else to charge a low price from that point forward. So a player who adopts a trigger strategy continues to choose the same action until some other player takes an action that triggers a different action by the first player. So to see how this works, suppose that firm A and firm B secretly meet illegally and agree to collude and raise prices. And by the way, this happens. They do meet and collude, and sometimes they get caught. Some people go to prison for it. All right, so again, they meet and they agree. If firm A cheats, right, they charge a low price, and firm B abides by the agreement, charges a high price. Again, firm A gets the 50 in profit, and firm B gets the negative 40. If both firms adopt the trigger strategy, there are conditions under which neither firm has an incentive to cheat on the collusive agreement. Because again, if either of them choose to cheat at any given point, then nobody's going to trust anybody from that point forward. That will trigger their strategies, and everybody will charge a low price from that point forward. The Nash equilibrium for the one-shot game will be the Nash equilibrium for the infinitely played game. All right, so if the present value of the cost of cheating is greater than the one-time benefit of cheating, then obviously it won't benefit them to cheat. So if the The present value of the infinite profit stream of colluding is greater than the benefit of cheating, which is just 50, then obviously it won't pay for them to cheat. And therefore high prices can be sustained. And that's really ultimately what happens in most markets. Like, that's why you don't see in most markets like reasonably low prices for everything, because the firms do wind up in this kind of weird situation where like they don't explicitly make agreements. They just kind of understand that they should be behaving in this way, charging the higher price, and playing under under the assumption that everybody's playing a trigger strategy. As soon as somebody starts to try to undercut, then everybody's going to undercut, and they will go down to zero. And nobody wants to do that, so obviously they will continue. I'll talk more about this as we go on with the lecture today. All right, so suppose the firms agreed to the collusive plan just outlined, and firm A believes that firm B will live up to the agreement. If firm A cheats by charging a low price, its profits will be $50 today and zero in all subsequent periods. The best choice for firm A when firm B charges a low price in these future periods is to charge a low price to earn zero. So that's essentially the trigger, the strategy. The trigger strategy has been triggered, and because firm A cheated today, firm B will charge a low price tomorrow, and so will firm A, and everybody will, and then zero is what everybody will make from that point forward. So if firm A cheats today, the present value of its profits will be $50 today and zero profits every period thereafter. If firm A does not cheat, it will earn $10 each period forever. The present value of the profits of firm A, if it cooperates, does not cheat, are going to be equal to pi times 1 plus I over I, which is equal to $10 times 1 plus I over I. So that is the present value of those $10 into the future, infinitely played, where again I is the interest rate. So for the numbers in the example, there's no incentive to cheat if the $50 is less than or equal to the present value of the income stream, which then allows us to solve for the interest rate that would be necessary in order to for the firm not to have incentive to cheat. So setting 50 less than or equal to 10, and then solving for I, multiplying both sides by I. So that's I over here. Multiplying this out, you have 10 plus 10I. Subtracting 10I from both sides, we have 40I is less than or equal to 10. Dividing both sides by 40 gets us to an interest rate of less than or equal to 25%. So if the interest rate is less than 25%, then firm A will lose more in present value by cheating than it will gain. And that's a reasonable situation that implies that this kind of collusion would not work, because you'll never really find interest rates that high anywhere. If there's a firm or a government offering that kind of return, then that's a very risky investment, and you should not take it probably. Like, the only reason any firm would pay out that kind of any kind of debt instrument or equity instrument would pay out that kind of return is because there's something weird going on, and they're probably not trustworthy, and they therefore have to compensate the borrower with a higher interest rate. So if the interest rate is less than or equal to 25%, it does not pay to cheat, and therefore the infinite profit stream will be greater than the $50, and the firms will be able to maintain a collusive agreement and therefore charge the high prices. Since firm B's incentives are symmetric, the same is true for firm B. Thus, when oligopolistic firms compete repeatedly over time, it is possible for them to collude and charge high prices to earn those that $10 each period. This benefits firms at the expense of consumers, obviously, since we are charged higher prices, and also leads to deadweight loss, as I mentioned, because in order for them to charge high prices, they have to limit the amount that they're selling, and that means that mutually beneficial transactions that would occur do not occur with people that have willingness to pay below the price they're charging, incapable of buying the good they want to buy. And that explains why there are laws against collusion, right? That's why we have the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission that monitor how concentrated markets are, stopping markets from even getting to this point where they can't even have the option to do so. But once they do have the option to do so, we have laws that stop them from doing exactly what we see happening. But that doesn't always stop people, and we know it. There are loopholes in this society. There's very powerful, smart lawyers that can be hired, and they can figure all sorts of things out for firms. And they do. All right, so that gets us to just the summarizing principle: sustaining cooperative outcomes with trigger strategies. Suppose a one-shot game is infinitely repeated and the interest rate is I. Further, suppose the cooperative one-shot payoff to a player is pi cooperative, so that's the amount they would get from cooperating, which in this case was 10. The maximum one-shot payoff if the player cheats on the collusive outcome is pi 50, pi cheat, which was 50 in the example. And the one-shot Nash equilibrium payoff is pi n, which was equal to 0 in our example. Then this will be the case. The condition has an intuitive interpretation when, if we just rearrange it, it basically means that the left-hand side represents the one-time gain of breaking the collusive agreement today, which is the difference between the profits they earned from cheating minus the profits they would earn from cooperating. So in this case, it would be 50 minus 10, which is 40. As long as that's less than or equal to the discounted value of the difference between the profits from cooperating minus the profits from winding up in the Nash equilibrium, which is the non-cooperative outcome. In this case, that is $10. So as long as this is the case, then the cooperative outcome can be sustained in the infinitely repeated game with the following trigger strategy. Cooperate if no player has ever been cheated on in the past. If any player cheats, punish the player by choosing the one-shot Nash equilibrium strategy forever after. Basically just summarizing everything we just did. All right, quick demonstration problem. Suppose firms A and B repeatedly face a situation presented in the table, but the interest rate is 40%. The firms agree to charge high prices each period, provided that neither firm has cheated on the agreement in the past. The question is, what are firm A's profits if it cheats on the collusive agreement? What are firm A's profits if it does not cheat on the collusive agreement? And the question finally is, does an equilibrium result where the firms charge high prices every period? All right, so let's consider each one in turn. What are firm A's profits if it cheats on the collusive agreement? Well, what is that? How much will the firm get if they cheat on the collusive agreement? 50, right? They will earn 50 by, again, cheating on the agreement while their opponent gets charges the higher price and winds up losing. All right. What are firm A's profits if it does not cheat on the collusive agreement? Well, again, that is the present discounted value of those profits into the future, which can be calculated by 10 times 1 plus I of the interest rate. The interest rate is 40%, and therefore that will equal $35. Does an equilibrium result where the firms charge the high price each period, therefore? Can they charge a high price each period given the conditions we're looking at, given the incentives they face, given the interest rate? Are you sure? It's not that up in the air. It's actually very clear cut. If they cheat, they make 50. If they don't cheat and maintain a high price each period, equilibrium, then they'll only make 35, right? So obviously 50 is better than 35, right? So therefore, no, right? They cannot, given the fact that there's a 40% interest rate. That is why. Because again, the profits into the future are severely diminished due to the discount factor based on the fact that there's this large interest rate that's being paid out in markets. And therefore, those gains do not outweigh the gains from cheating today. And therefore, it makes sense for them to cheat today, which will trigger a trigger strategy, which means everybody will wind up in the Nash equilibrium for the second round further, which means they'll make zero economic profits. And low prices will be charged in the market. Any questions on that? All right, so let's talk a little bit of real world conditions. So factors affecting collusion in pricing games. So one of the factors is that the firms need to know who their rivals are so they know who they need to punish if somebody were to break an agreement. They need to know who their rivals' customers are so that if punishment is necessary, they can take those customers away by charging lower prices. They need to know when their rivals deviate from the collusive agreement so they know when to begin the punishment. And they must be able to successfully punish rivals for deviating from the collusive agreement, meaning the threats must be credible. The threat to trigger the strategy to charge low prices forever after must be credible. Much like if we threaten to send an armada to a country that seems to be a little bit, antagonistic, we're actually not just moving ships along the ocean close to where they are. All right, number of firms. So let's consider these in turn. Number of firms. The fewer the firms that exist in an oligopoly, the easier it is to collude. The more firms there are, the more firms you have to monitor. So if there are N firms in the industry, the total amount of monitoring that must go on to sustain the collusive agreement is going to be N times N minus 1. Every firm is going to have to monitor all other firms besides themselves. The total number of monitors needed in the market grows rapidly as the number of firms increases. If there are 5 firms, each firm must monitor 4 other firms, so the total number of monitors needed in the market would be 20 in that case. The cost of monitoring rivals reduces the gains from colluding. It costs money in terms of explicit and implicit costs to monitor rivals, which may affect those collusive profits. So under these circumstances, the threat used to sustain the collusive outcome is not credible if monitoring costs too much, and the collusion will fail. The relative size of the firms matters. So there are economies of scale in monitoring, meaning that there are lower average costs for larger firms of monitoring. So monitoring and policing costs constitute a much greater share of total cost for smaller firms than for larger firms. A large firm, let's say with 20 outlets, can monitor the prices charged by a small competitor with, let's say, only 1 outlet by simply checking prices at that one store. To check the prices of rivals, the smaller firms must hire individuals to monitor 20 outlets. Obviously, these are not necessarily practical examples because the world is digital and it's a little easier to go about doing these things, but it just does highlight the fact that this does need to go on within these markets. They need to constantly be monitoring each other, and that does carry a cost, and that can affect whether or not the collusive outcome can be sustained. The history of the market also will have an impact on whether or not collusion can be sustained. One key issue not addressed as far as how firms will reach an understanding to collude. One way is for the firms to explicitly meet and verbally warn their rivals not to steal their customers, or else they will be punished. Again, that is illegal. Alternatively, firms might not meet at all, but instead gain an understanding over time of the way that the game is played and thus achieve what's called tacit collusion. Tacit collusion occurs when the firms do not explicitly conspire to collude, but accomplish collusion indirectly. So again, it's about experience. It's about being in the market for a while, trying things out, charging the higher price, seeing if your rivals are going to charge that high price, and then just kind of going that way without having to ever get behind closed doors and break any laws. Doing this is not illegal. That firms are free to charge prices that they want to charge. They just can't get together and charge prices. They can't get together and agree upon what they're going to charge together. They have to be competitive against each other. In contrast, if a firm learns over time that its opponents are unable to successfully punish it for undercutting prices, then tacit collusion will be unlikely to result. If firms observe that rivals do carry out their threats, their history will result in collusion. So again, it's about kind of trial and error, sort of figuring out how the players are going to behave and what people can get away with. But again, this is the most common outcome that you'll find in most markets, this tacit collusion. This is why, in the end, there isn't a lot of this sort of backdoor deal type of behavior, because firms just tacitly collude. They just start to act as though they had agreements, and they're able to sustain collusive agreements because of that. And therefore, we wind up getting charged high prices. But if you're the manager of a firm, you benefit, so it's a good thing for you. All right. And of course, punishment mechanisms. The pricing mechanisms firms use also affect their ability to punish rivals that do not cooperate. If the market is a posted price market where a single price is posted and charged to all the firm's customers, the cost of punishing an opponent is higher than in markets in which different customers are quoted different prices. A firm that wishes to punish a rival by stealing its customers not only has to charge a low price to the rival's customers, but must also lower prices to its own customers. In an industry in which different prices are charged to different customers, which is called price discrimination, which is something we'll talk about in the next chapter, a firm can punish its rival by charging the rival's customers a low price while continuing to charge its own customers a higher price. All right, let's do a quick application of the infinitely repeated game to product quality. So we can highlight the fact that this approach to understanding these kind of interactions doesn't necessarily need to be confined to the case of the pricing game. So the theory of infinitely repeated games can be used to analyze the desirability of firm policies such as like warranties and guarantees. Customers desire durable, high-quality products at low prices. Firms wish to maximize profits. Sometimes those things might be in conflict. So in a one-shot game where the firms and the customers engage only one time, any profits made by the firm must be made today without the prospect of repeat business. So a firm may have an incentive to sell a shoddy, useless product, especially if its customers cannot determine the quality of the products prior to purchase. A simple example of this might be like kind of like the strange like Amazon transactions where like you find that one really rare thing and there's like one seller selling it and nobody else is selling it and nobody's giving them a rating and they're likely to disappear tomorrow, but you take the chance and you wind up with like a shirt that's like the size of a child's head, whereas you thought that you would get a normal size shirt, that sort of thing. I'm sure things like that have happened to you if you are an Amazon shopper. Anyway, in a one-shot play of the game, the Nash equilibrium strategy is for the firm to purchase a low-quality product and for consumers to not buy the product. So we can look at it as a normal form version of the game where the consumer can either buy or not buy the good, and the firm has the option to either produce a low-quality or a high-quality product. If the consumer does not buy and the firm makes a low-quality product, both of them lose. If the consumer does buy and the firm makes a low-quality product, the firm wins and the consumer loses. If the firm makes a high-quality product and the consumer doesn't buy it, the firm loses and the consumer is just even. And if the consumer buys the high-quality product, then everybody wins. We can identify the Nash equilibrium, again, by taking the perspective of each player, checking out what they would do optimally in response to each of their opponent's strategies. In response to the firm creating a low-quality product, what should the consumer do? Don't buy. 0 is better than -10. In response to the firm creating a high-quality product, what should the consumer do? Buy. 1 is better than 0. So we see that the consumer does not have a dominant strategy in this game. Take the perspective of the firm in response to the consumer not buying, what should the firm do? Low quality product, 0 is better than -10. In response to the consumer buying, what should the firm do? Low quality product, because again, 50 is better than 1. We see that the firm has a dominant strategy to play low quality, meaning that in the one-shot version of the game, it makes sense for a firm to produce a low quality product. We see that the Nash outcome of this game, the likely outcome of this situation, is that the firm produces a low quality product and that the consumer does not buy it. So in a one-shot game, the consumer chooses not to buy the product because she knows the firm will take the money and run. The story is different if the game is infinitely repeated. If the consumer tells the firm, I'll buy your product and will continue to buy it if it's of good quality, but if it turns out to be shoddy, I'll tell all my friends never to purchase anything from you again. Given that strategy by the consumer, which is essentially a trigger strategy, because they would sort of have an agreement that the firm produces a high quality product and the consumer buys it. But if somebody cheats on that agreement, then forever after the consumer doesn't buy, right? So that's essentially the trigger there. So given the strategy by the consumer, if the interest rate is not too high, the best alternative is to sell a high quality product for the firm. When the interest rate is low, though, the one-time gain will be more than offset by lost future sales. So the lesson to be drawn from the example is twofold. First, if your firm desires to be infinitely lived, it does not pay to cheat customers if the one-time gain is more than offset by lost future sales. This is true even if your firm cannot be sued or if there are no government regulations against selling shoddy merchandise. Second, you should recognize that any production process is likely to have bad runs. No matter how well-intended you are to produce high-quality products, sometimes things go wrong and you wind up producing something that's not that great of quality. To guard against this and stopping the customer from triggering their strategy and marring your reputation and forever lowering your profits, many firms offer guarantees that the product will be of high quality. If an error occurs in production, the consumer can obtain a new item, be satisfied, and not punish the firm by spreading the news that it sells shoddy merchandise. So obviously, this is all very intuitive. It's not complicated to come up with this very sort of reasonable result, but firms don't operate ethically. It's not about like what's right and wrong. It's about like the bottom line. And so this type of analysis provides justification for why it makes sense for a firm not to intentionally try to rob consumers and create shoddy products, because in the end they will not survive. It's not complicated, but it's an application of the infinitely repeated game. All right, why don't we take a break? Let's come back at 8:30 and we'll finish off the chapter.